I wanted to start with the basics because one of my followers, Ron, asked, why does this region of the world have such an incredible influence on the global economy? A pretty basic question, but maybe a good place to start.
Well, so more than one reason. I mean, oil is the principal reason why it's had such an enormous impact on the global economy for quite a number of decades now, right? Since about the 1930s, when Saudi Arabia began exporting a lot of oil, and we cut deals with them. All the other Gulf states in the region, and then Iran as well, produced most of the world's oil, as we did as well. But we became increasingly reliant on them over time as our production dropped. So 20% of the world's oil, 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas goes from the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz to the rest of the world. We're less reliant on it today than we were in the past, but China, Japan, South Korea, all those countries, Europe, are reliant on that flow of oil. In addition, fertilizer is transported through there. Agricultural products are transported through there. And fertilizer, particularly right now, Katie, this is the planting season for farmers. And they've cut off about half the world's supply of fertilizer going out to the rest of the world. So this creates all kinds of complications, not just the rising cost of oil, gasoline, jet fuel, but also has an impact on the way in which we grow our food, which is why they're so integral to the world's, supply chain, to use a technical term.
Yeah, I need to read Daniel Yergin's book Oil. I
Yeah,
interviewed him many years ago. It's a tome
it's a big
about
book.
oil because honestly, I know that the US produces a lot of oil, but
Yep.
they call it like it's a different kind of oil, and then you
So you're
have
talking about light sweet crude versus
yes, light sweet
heavy
crude,
sour
and then
crude. Yep,
Venezuela does the thick
really heavy.
heavy oil, and then the
Russia
Persian
does as well. Yeah. So
like it is very confusing. Who knew there were so many different kinds of oil,
Well,
Ron?
and they're used for different things. I mean, up until the Ukraine war, we imported about 300,000 barrels of oil from Russia. It's a very heavy sour crude, but they use it to clean the refiners in order to process other types of oil into gasoline, heating oil, jet fuel, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, depending on what type of oil you're using, it's used for different things. And so, yeah, Venezuela, really heavy sulfur content. Russia, really heavy sulfur content. We have a different grade of oil that's produced here that we get from fracking, in the Permian Basin, in the Dakotas, places like that. It's a very complex business, a very costly business, a very risky business at the end of the day as well. And so that's why there's so much volatility in that industry.
You should do a whole explainer for us because, it's so complicated. So, oil is now what at
96,
$96.
96 here, 103 in London. Yeah.
Okay. Can you talk about the impact of these rising oil prices on the global economy? You talked about fertilizer and all kinds of things coming from the region. But in general, can you talk about sort of the ripple effect, if you will,
Yeah.
of oil prices and why it's so concerning?
It's twofold. And, for us, it's a little bit different because the United States now produces about 13.7 million barrels a day. Technically, we're a net exporter of crude oil. So the oil coming from the Middle East, we are far less reliant on than, let's say, when you and I were kids in the 1970s and we were in gas lines for an hour and a half and, people were getting beaten up waiting for gasoline because there were massive shortages here in the United States. Having said that, however, the price of gas is now up about $3.80 is the national average. It's up from, nearly $2.90 just about 4 or 5 weeks ago. So that cuts into consumer discretionary spending. People can't spend as much money on other stuff because they're paying up for gasoline. Now, again, it's not quite like the 70s. Our cars are more fuel efficient. We have some electric vehicles, but the rest of the world also relies on relatively inexpensive gasoline, and that's going up all over the globe. So it has two impacts, to be really just very straight and simple. Number one, it boosts inflation and it affects the cost of living. And number two, if it goes up high enough, it gets consumers to stop spending, which then raises the risk of recession. Maybe not as much here, but certainly around the rest of the world. And you run into this global problem that we used to call stagflation. Inflation too high, growth too low, unemployment goes up. So that is a type of problem that we haven't really faced for quite a long time. We have a mini version of the 1970s going on right now, not the same experience that we had growing up, but it's enough to really pinch middle income and lower income consumers in a meaningful way.
And what about, you mentioned fertilizer and this is planting season and food prices, but how else does this sort of skyrocketing oil prices, what impact does that have on food prices in general and why?
Well, it certainly reduces potentially the availability of food, and that will have a bigger impact on the impoverished countries that rely on subsistence farming and things like that. If they can't get fertilizer, they can't grow food. Here, it would likely push up the price. And again, we're already complaining about grocery bills. We're complaining about affordability, housing, gasoline prices. Instead of being down, are now up year over year, and it just continues to kind of chip away at the ability of Americans to, buy whatever it is they need. And again, it depends where you are in the income ladder. If you're in the top
Right.
10 or 20%, you don't really notice this stuff. But if you're middle income and lower income, it has a profound impact on what choices you make on a daily and weekly basis. What do you buy? What do you put off? Do you shave your grocery bill in order to pay for gas so you can get to work? It does complicate life for a lot of people because it does bleed through to the economy so dramatically.
And this can't be turned around overnight.
No.
I was reading in Barron's last week. I thought you'd be impressed by.
Really? Yeah. It was after you finished The Economist?
Yeah. Well, I have always read The Economist, but I even impressed myself that I was reading a Barron's article. But they were talking about how it takes weeks. I mean,
Yeah.
weeks, if not months, to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. So it's not as if, like, oh, we're pulling out of the war militarily. Oil prices and gas prices are immediately going to go down. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so Iran's got to vote in this too, right? I mean, if we can pull out tomorrow, but they could still fire at tankers that they don't deem to be friendly. They've already said they will not allow passage of U.S. or Israeli tankers or anybody that's allied with countries that are not allied with them. So they're letting Chinese tankers go through. Their own tankers are going through, but they can also still fire on tankers. They can fire on oil installations throughout the Middle East, as they did again today. And so, to the extent that there's damage to oil facilities, there's a limited amount of oil that comes through the strait until Iran allows it to, or until the United States were to take it over militarily and allow for the free transport of all those oil
That
goods.
sounds pretty tough though, because they've
But
laid so many mines and they still have pretty powerful defenses that are
yeah,
attacking those boats.
yeah, they have sea boats that can, and then they have the underwater mines. Anywhere from 2,000 to 6,000 of those can be laid. They've done this in the past during the Iran-Iraq War, and again, I think during Operation Desert Storm back in 1991. And yeah, you have to. We don't have minesweepers. We just decommissioned all our minesweepers. So getting those mines out of the way, ensuring safe passage, and if you do it with U.S. Navy ships in a 21-mile corridor where the Strait of Hormuz is, they can be sitting ducks, so they can get shot at, they can get sunk, and all this takes time. And like you say, weeks or months to get back to normal. And what we don't know is the duration of this conflict, right? I mean, the president could decide to pull out tomorrow. He could fight till May, September, whenever, until he achieves and the Israel government achieves the objectives that they've set out. We just don't know. And then, as your prior guest said, with Iran as wounded as it is, will they just lash out in any way possible to make this as painful as it can be for as long as it can be, just to retaliate against the U.S. And Israel for having done this to begin with?
Yeah, how high do you think gas prices are gonna go? Or you're not Karnak, I know, Ron. That's a reference for people who are over 50 and watch Johnny Carson. But,
Well,
do you
my
have any.
favorite Karnak, by the way, I don't know if you remember this one. He holds it up and he says, and I know this was written by Pat McCormick, at least I think it was, "Sis boom ba." And he opens it up and he says, "The sound a sheep makes when it explodes." That was I thought, one of the greatest Karnaks ever. But having said that, getting back to your question, um, probably pushing $4 a gallon is where we're going to end up. I mean, if there's something else that takes place and oil were to go to 120, 130, $140, then you're starting to talk about $5 a gallon gas. And that's really going to, that's going to hurt. And it also affects the Federal Reserve's decision on interest rates, which, by the way, we have a decision coming tomorrow. There's no way the Fed's cutting rates with gasoline prices going up, adding to inflation pressures. And that may keep them from cutting rates no more than once for the remainder of the year. We don't know, but we'll find out what they have to say about that tomorrow when they make the announcement and then hold their news conference.
John, stay here because I'm sure you have some questions for Ron about the stock market that I really want you to ask him in a second. Will you stay here for a few minutes? Thank you. Wait, Ron,
Who's John?
huh?
Who's John?
My husband,
Oh,
you know, Molnar.
okay. Yeah, okay.
Okay, so before we get to the
Yeah.
market, and I don't know, he's going upstairs now, but hopefully he'll come back. What about Russia? I asked Richard Haas, and I actually he couldn't answer this question for me, Ron. Russia is apparently giving the Iranians help, intelligence assistance,
Yeah.
and yet the Treasury Department announced a pause on U.S. sanctions on Russian oil. So they're helping the Russians while the Russians are hurting us. Can you
Seems to be
explain?
the case. Um, yeah, I mean, the reason they lifted these sanctions temporarily, pardon me, into April, it was to, take some pressure off the available supplies. There was a lot of oil that's just floating around the world, uncaptured, if you will, that the Russians could sell. Now, what the problem here is, if indeed, as has been alleged, the Russians are giving the Iranians, as the Chinese may well be doing as well, um, specific geographic information about the placement of U.S. troops and ships and so on and so forth and their movements. That's to our detriment. We're allowing them to earn an extra $150 million a day by lifting these sanctions, which then helps them fuel the war effort in Ukraine. So it is really cognitive dissonance from a foreign policy perspective, writ large. I mean, we don't understand exactly why, other than they're desperately trying to keep the price of oil from going up, and they would go so far as to take this step for that to happen. And that's, again, we've always questioned, how close closely aligned President Trump and President Putin might be in certain instances. And this is another case where he's giving a break to a country that we have historically considered an adversary. And certainly in the war against Ukraine, we've thought that now for many years. But they're just desperate to keep the price down. You got the midterms coming up, and affordability is an issue. So, that's probably all there is to it.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess right, affordability more important than
Yeah. Anything else at the moment?
yeah, yeah. Then
Strategic geopolitical goals, right? Yeah.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
All right, let me ask you about. A lot of people are saying the gas where they are is already over $5
Yeah. It depends where you are.
a gallon. I think somebody said in the Hamptons, and somebody else.
Yeah.
No, they said
Yes. I know.
California over $5 a
Yes.
gallon. So I think it's already getting high.
But you know what the reasons for that? The farther you are away from refinery operations, and the longer it takes to get gasoline to you, then particularly that in specific case in the Hamptons pushes it above $5. California also has additional taxes and environmental regulations that push up the cost relative to the national average. So again, we're at 380 nationally, but California, the Hamptons, and places like that are different geographies, have different rules, and or in the case of the Hamptons again, are much farther away from a source of oil delivery, and that pushes the price up because it increases the cost of transportation.
Okay, let me ask you a couple questions, then I'm going to let you go about airline prices and jet
Oh yeah.
fuel. I know a lot of people are thinking about, their airline tickets. And when do you think we're going to see a huge increase in fares? Have we already?
Yeah. And the CEO of Delta, just before you and I started talking, came out and said that the price of jet fuel has doubled, which means that they are going to push up the price of airline tickets even more than we've already seen. And they've been pretty expensive of late. Now, what he also said was that they don't see demand falling among airline passengers, which is really strange. I mean, and you know this. I mean, you travel enough that airports, all the TSA stuff and the other things that are
Right.
happening right now, notwithstanding, people are still flying. Right. And they seem for some reason to be price insensitive. It really doesn't seem to keep them from, getting up and getting on a plane. But yeah, you can very much expect that airfares are going to go up, whether it's economy, whether it's, first class, business class, whatever it is you fly, or private. Those
I
jet
know.
fuel prices are going up, and that's
Yeah.
just going to push up a ticket price noticeably.
Well, let me ask you about the markets. And
Yeah,
I know that my understanding is they're actually up today. Oh,
a little
look,
bit.
my husband is, he's back. So what do you want to ask Ron about the markets? Here, everyone, John Molnar. Have you met Ron before?
We have not met. Hey, John, how are you?
How are you, Ron?
Good, thanks.
Where were you going? Yeah. Well, what do you?
Yeah.
Yes, I think the markets might be up modestly today, but year to date, they're down. And then, of course, you have the Magnificent Seven or so down.
Down.
And
What does that mean? What is magnificent?
well, those are the big tech stocks: Nvidia, Microsoft, Netflix, Amazon,
Yeah.
Apple. So, I guess what's your view of the equity markets, where they are, and are you surprised how well they've held up in general, given all the uncertainty that you and Katie have been discussing?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we've had a 5% correction so far, year to date, and we're a little bit off those lows. I think, look, we were down 3 weeks in a row. Yesterday was kind of a good news day because oil fell $5 a barrel. It rebounded $2.50 today, so that kind of muted the impact on what we had was at the start of the day, I think, a couple 100-point gain, and we finished up 40 points or something like that. So, this is still a headline-driven market. We're watching the Fed tomorrow. Earnings will start to come in again in a few months. And the U.S. economy, net, for all these different things we're talking about, is still growing. We're not in recession. We're in a jobs recession. Inflation's higher than we want it to be, but corporate profits are still growing at a pretty healthy clip. So that's holding up the U.S. market relatively well, even though we're down year to date. The rest of the world, though, as it did last year, is outperforming the United States. So that's something that we've not seen in decades, where we're seeing a sustained outperformance of overseas markets relative to the U.S. So look, I happen to think that we're in for a notable correction. And, on average, the U.S. stock market corrects 14% in any given year, peak to trough, and then starts to go up again. So it wouldn't shock me if that was, in our future. Again, a lot of questions, though, with respect to the folks watching us, really depends on how much time you have to retirement, when you need the money, what you need the money for, as to how you deal with a portfolio. If you're a young person and, you wait this out, if you're drawing money out, you might want to lighten your exposure to stocks overall. But yeah, look, I think, John, I think we're at risk of a more meaningful correction. There are some other issues playing into the market as well. There are concerns about the quality of loans that private credit companies have made, and a few other things that, can affect financial companies.
Any concern about the transition in the Fed coming up in the confirmation?
I mean, yeah, I am, but it's not going to happen until Tom Tillis lifts the hold. The senator wants an end to the investigation of the current Fed chair, Jay Powell, for allegedly making misstatements to the Senate about the cost overruns at the Fed, which is a totally nonsensical thing. A judge has already thrown out the.
It's so insane, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. I mean, look, we've not seen stuff like this before. We've seen political holds before, and we've seen people that the Senate didn't want to confirm. This is just going after Jay Powell for cost overruns in a 100-year-old building.
Completely trumped up accusations.
Entirely. I mean, and Jay Powell's as straight a guy as you can get. He's a lawyer. He is a Republican that Donald Trump appointed in his first term, Joe Biden reappointed in his second, and he's been a good Fed chair. There's nothing about him, that's untoward. So yeah, it's totally nonsensical. And you've heard multiple senators, even Tim Scott, say that he doesn't believe Jay Powell did anything wrong. So, look, I'm not a big Kevin Warsh fan in the sense the new Fed chair that's presumably coming in. He didn't want to cut interest rates at the depths of the financial crisis in 2008. And so I don't know why he'd want to cut them now if he wouldn't do it when the entire financial system was collapsing in
Maybe
2008.
because he's got a president who's forcing his hand, Ron?
Perhaps, and he wants the job. Maybe it's that. So we'll see. I think his hands are going to be tied. He's one vote out of 12. So when he comes into the chair in May, his first decision will be in June. And if inflation is still above the Fed's 2% target, he may not have the latitude to cut rates, and that could be a problem for the stock market down the road too.
Okay, how do you feel?
I feel good. I feel better.
And so again, one of my
that was
followers,
the first. I've never been interviewed by a husband and wife team before.
Yeah, but before we go, one of my followers asked, and I think you've already kind of answered this, Ron. And you're not Jim Cramer, but what should the average Joe be doing? And I guess from what I heard from you, it really depends on your situation.
Yeah, always. I mean, it's giving specific advice is always very, very dangerous. But again, time in the market versus timing the market, is really a factor in the way in which people should view things. So if you're 10, 20 years out from retirement and you're committing a certain amount of your income to investment and savings, you just keep doing that. I just got my Medicare card this month, so I'm turning 65 at the end of the month.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I am my grandfather now. We're in that window where by age 70 or 72, you have to start taking the money out. So maybe you lighten your exposure to stocks and, you shift more towards bonds or other, what we consider slightly safer or less
You
volatile
sound like my
investments.
dad.
You're older than I am.
No, no, when my dad's no longer living, but
I'm sorry.
that's okay. But when he was starting to give me financial advice, he was extremely, extremely conservative.
Yeah.
And Mueller was like, "What are you, crazy?" And so he got me into riskier investments. So I
You're
hope
welcome.
I remember you were always quite conservative. You loved cash more than options that we got from General Electric. You liked cash compensation, if I recall correctly. I think we had that
yes, and I
conversation.
also I always believed in keeping the money I made instead of making more on the money I earned. But
Yeah.
I think it made me a little too conservative,
And
especially in this
that's a risk. And look,
market.
people are living longer. And so they have, a longer period of time in which to have exposure to the stock market before they have to start taking that money out. I think now we've got until we're 72 years old to start taking, mandating, have mandated withdrawals from your 401ks or other savings
I didn't
programs.
even know so I don't have much time, Ron.
I don't know how old you are exactly. I mean, but
I'm almost 70.
you don't look a day over 50.
Thank you. I know. John is always like, because he's 6 years younger than I am. When I tell him how I am, he's just like,
I had no idea.
You didn't
Anyway,
ask.
all right. Listen, I'm gonna let you go because we're gonna wrap this up with
Yep.
someone named Juliette Cayenne, who's
She's
a
great.
national security expert. And but Ron, thanks so much. It's
Thanks,
always
Katie.
great to see you. And
You as well.
by the way, you can probably tell everyone Ron is one of the nicest people in the business and
Bad.
one of my favorites. So thank you, Ron.
Thank you. Good to see you, Katie.
Okay, talk to you soon.
You will.
Bye.